Hello and welcome to the video. This is a video on the basics of INAV auto landing for fixed wings. Now, this one has been a long time in the making. It's probably been on my list for about 7 or 8 months since about INAV 7.12 came out, I think. I need to say a massive thank you to one of the INAV developers, a chap called Mark, who came up with this whole concept, and a big thank you to all the developers for actually making it happen. Now, auto landing is not something that's new to radio-controlled aircraft and autonomous flying. I did a video a while ago where I showed you with Ben up at 3DXR how to set that up in Ardu Pilot. However, in INAV, it's now absolutely an option. So you can tell the plane where you want it to land, either as part of a mission or set it up as something called a safe home. A safe home is just the same as with multirotors, and the plane will figure out everything and come into land. Now, automated landing we've had in multirotors for a very long time, but that's easy, right? Because the multirotor flies back to the place it was armed, or a safe home location, whichever is nearest and how you've got it set up. Then it will kind of pause for a moment and then start to descend. Once it detects it's hit the ground, it will kind of turn off the props. Landing a fixed wing, for those of you that fly both, you will know that landing a fixed wing requires a little bit more effort. As a pilot, you have to kind of be aware of which way the wind is blowing, if there is one. Ideally, you want to be landing into wind, if that's possible. You need to have an idea of how high you are, how floaty the plane is, whether or not you need the prop on or off, the kind of glide angle, the kind of speed that you need, and ultimately have a very good idea where you kind of want to land the thing. And all that kind of calculation is going on in your head, and that all has to be transposed into INAV. Now, the idea with this, when I started looking at this, and apologies for the longer ramble, but this is explaining why this video is actually split into 2 parts. This part is to help you understand the basics. It isn't a replacement for going reading the fantastic documentation in the INAV stuff. Go and check that out. But that once we've gone through the basics and hopefully help you understand what all that stuff means, and the weather gets better in the UK and the grass gets shorter again, we can actually fly the Dart XL that I put a LiDAR in the belly for, and I'll actually show you how all this works. So this is the first part for all of you that have been asking for a video on this. Again, apologies, it's kind of 2-parter, but the way it's working at the moment, it's already been 6 or 7 months since INAV 7.1.1 came out, where Mark and I were planning this video. And then over the summer, when the weather got good enough, the grass got really high. LiDARs hate things like grass. It means that the LiDAR will kind of incorrectly read the ground height, and it needs to be kind of flat and a reasonably calm day so I can kind of demo this. So this one is more about the basics, how you set it up, some of the tips and tricks, how it works. The next one will actually set it up on a plane and take it out to fly. Now, there are a number of things that you need to do before you get into this. Putting things like an auto landing sequence in an INAV plane or wing requires a little bit of thought, and it also requires the plane to be set up very well initially, so it will fly great, tuned fab, it'll do a loiter perfectly, it'll do a return to home great and reliably, even slightly windier conditions. Trying to do auto landing when the plane hasn't been configured and set up well isn't going to work great at all, because it relies on all of that features, all that functionality in order to execute the auto landing. If you have a LiDAR fitted, and in the video where we're going to try this out, there is a LiDAR in the belly of that Dart XL, it does allow you an extra little bit of functionality, which is the flare functionality, where you can actually, as it comes in for the final piece, kind of pick the nose up and just land gracefully into the grass or on the runway, whatever it is that you've got. It isn't essential. You can absolutely do this without a LiDAR, but I've been using one of the little Bennywake LiDARs in the belly of that plane. I'll put a link down below if you want to go and have a look. This is something that you are going to have to play with and tune for the particular model that you're playing with, because as you know, if you have several different fixed wing models, they require different approaches, different heights, different speeds, different flares. Some of them like to carry weight, some of them want the motor on all the time, some of them are quite happy knocking the motor off and floating into the ground. Depends on what it is, right? So this isn't something that's foolproof. There is going to be a little bit of jiggery pokery, to use a technical term, to get everything dialed in. And that's because every landing area has a set of information that goes along with it to give INAV the best possible chance of being able to land back at that place. You can save information both as safe homes, but also as part of a mission too. And each of those things that I've talked about that as a pilot you kind of have to think about, and the height you're going to come in at, the kind of glide angle, how you're going to approach, how you're going to do your downward leg, all those kind of things, INAV has to be told, and it has to be stored along with the location. So let's talk a little bit about how this actually works. What happens when you initiate a automated landing with a fixed wing? Well, the first thing it does is it flies back to the home location, as you would expect, and then it circles the home location for about 30 seconds. And what it's doing is it is feeling which direction the wind is coming in on. You can tell it to land in a very specific direction. So if you have a thin strip of tarmac or grass like we have here that you have to land on, that's kind of treated like the runway, then you can absolutely tell it that. But by default, it'll try and figure out which way the wind is coming from by doing that, flying around in a circle for about 30 seconds. Once it has finished that, then it is going to fly the downward leg at what's called the approach altitude. And you can set that. We'll have a look at that in a moment. Once it's finished that, then it will fly the base leg and it will reduce the height to 2/3 of the approach. So say it was 300 feet, the approach altitude was, so it goes down the field at 300 feet, and then when it turns and does the base leg, it'll drop down to 200 feet, and then it'll do another turn and it will start the approach. And it will gently lose height as it goes towards the land area, and eventually as it gets to the very end, it can do one of several things, including gliding and flaring, to eventually come to a rest on the ground. And again, if you have a LiDAR fitted, you have an extra bit of functionality, which is the ability to set a height at which it will flare and pull the nose up and just help arrest that forward momentum, keep it in the air until it kind of flops into the grass or onto the tarmac. So for each of the fixed wing approaches, there is all of this information that is stored for each one of them. It looks really complicated, fixed wing approach, index, approach altitude, landing altitude. Let's go through each of these. Again, this is all covered in the documentation in a little bit more detail, but hopefully once you've seen this video, it'll make more sense. So the index is just the number. There are 0 to 7 are used for safe homes. So those are the standard locations around you that would be safe to land in if you're flying a bit further away. Numbers 8 and 16 are used for mission flying. The next one to go to is then the approach altitude. That's the altitude that it's going to fly the downward leg on, and that is set in centimeters. So that's an easy one. Next one is the land altitude. Yep, the land altitude, well, that's going to be 0, right? Well, yes, it should be, but it might not be. You might be actually setting the place that you're going to land, and it might be slightly different from where you're going to take off. So you might want to set the land altitude. You can also have the approach direction. The approach direction, you can either choose left or right. And then you have 2 approach headings. If these are both 0, then they are disabled and the plane will figure it out based on the wind direction. But you can set them for a bearing to be the 2 ways that you can land on maybe a particular runway. So it might be that, coming in from the left or coming in from the right hand side, you might have 2 specific numbers, or you might only have 1 because that's the way it has to happen. Maybe one end of the runway is covered in big trees. Positive values in both of these means that both or either can be used. The plane will use the one that has the best chance of landing with the wind that it detects. Negative value means that direction is exclusive. So if it is minus 180, it will absolutely only come in heading southbound to that location that it's going to try and land at. The last one is for sea level, whether or not you're using the height above the armed location or whether or not it's all sea level based. There are a number of additional params that you kind of only set once, and these are very handy. Again, I would just have a look at this slide, go and have a read at it. We'll go through them very quickly. First one, nav fixed wing land approach length. This is the length of the final approach measured from the land side to the last turning point. There is a default for this. Again, it's in centimeters, so be super careful with this when you're setting it up. I'll show you how to use that in a second. You have nav, fixed wing land, final approach, pitch to throttle mod. This is a modifier for the pitch to throttle ratio for the final approach. It just means that it can be used to reduce speed during that final approach, because normally as you put the nose of the plane down, as it starts to descend, you're going to pick up speed, and you can actually affect how that's done with this setting. Next one then is the nav fixed wing land glide altitude. This is the altitude at which the glide phase happens. This is one of the very last things, so maybe a meter or two above the ground. This is when this is going to happen, and basically it's going to turn off the prop and it's going to come in. Next one then is the flare altitude. Again, this requires a LiDAR, which is why I put a LiDAR on it. This is the very, very final part of the landing, and this I would probably put it to be about a meter, and that means that in the very final bit where it's about waist high, the plane is going to pitch up and it's going to flare and slow down, and that's going to make a slightly nicer landing. We have the nav fixed wing land glide pitch, which is the pitch value for the gliding phase, and usually you're going to have slightly nose up by a couple of degrees, and then nav fixed wing land flare pitch by the default is 8 degrees nose up, so that's really kind of making it lose all of that speed as it does the final little bits of landing. Last one is one about tailwind. Nav fixed wing land max tailwind. This is the maximum tailwind if no landing direction with downwind is available. So the wind strengths below this value are ignored. So if you're going to be flying in windy stuff, it's probably worthwhile having a look at that. But all of these will be set for a landing. I'll show you. So let's go through all those numbers and settings, give you an idea of how I would set up something like this. So here's the landing location in the lower right hand corner. That's kind of where I want it to land. And I actually want it to come in only one direction, which is down this boundary here, just to the side, in order to get to this landing location. Maybe over here out of the right of the frame, there's a line of trees or houses or whatever that I don't want it flying over. So I want it to land in this kind of configuration. Initially come in at a height of about 30 meters, then to do its approach, a nice long leisurely approach so it doesn't pick up too much speed, and eventually landing hopefully somewhere about there. So I've set up fixed wing approach, and again, here's the numbers. So this first one is the index. The second is the approach altitude in centimeters. Be careful about this. I kind of wish it was almost set in meters. It would be a lot easier. You have to kind of do a little bit of mental maths. I've had to have a couple of goes at this slide because it's so easy to get these numbers wrong. So I would triple check every time you think you've got the right number. Come back and double check. But this 3,000 centimeters equates to 30 meters, which is this bit here. It's this height. The next number then after that is the land altitude. It's going to be where we take off from, and it's basically going to be at that level. Again, if you're going to be setting it where the land point is going to be either on something that's above you or maybe below you in a valley or whatever, then that's obviously going to have to be set there. Next one then is the direction. This one is the direction that it's going to come in on, which kind of sets the vector for this final approach piece. Because it's a negative number, both of these negative numbers, then it's going to use just one. And again, there's loads of different options here, but this is how you tell it. It has to come in this direction. And that might be because, again, over on the right-hand side, out of shot, there might be trees or houses or something that we don't want it flying over. Last number then is going to be whether or not it's the above sea level stuff or just relative to takeoff. And we're going to use relative to takeoff. I just find that a lot easier to keep everything straight. So that is how we're going to set up fixed wing approach. All we're really doing here is really setting two big things. The first is the fact that it's a 30 meter altitude that I want it to start all the gubbins at. The second is that it's an exclusive direction that I want it to try and land in the landing point. This is the direction that it needs to come in on in order to get to the landing point, which is going to force it to fly down this yellow line. Other things that are set here, first one is the land approach length, which is 63,000. That equates to 630 meters. That sets this length of how long it's going to take. For a small plane, you're not going to need anything like this, but it's a nice, very gentle approach to get into this location. Setting this, you're also kind of setting this crosswing leg length as well, because it's either going to be 50% of the approach length. So if this is 630 meters, this is by default going to be 315 meters, or it's this bit here is 4 times the loiter radius, whichever is bigger. So be careful of that. If you're going to have a really, really big approach to the landing location, it means that the crosswind leg is also going to be very, very long as well. So just be aware of that. The land glide altitude is set to 200 or 2 meters, which is the point at which, when it's 2 meters above the ground, or it thinks it's 2 meters above the ground, it's going to go into glide, which is going to turn off the motor and also adjust the pitch of the nose to how you've set it. By default, that's 0 in this, as I'm looking at it at the moment. I would potentially set that to be maybe 1 or 2 degrees up. Again, depends on the plane. The final thing is the land flare altitude, which is set to 1 meter. So as it gets to kind of between chest and waist height on me, this then is going to go into flare, which means that it's going to pull the nose up and going to, by default, a positive nose up pitch of 8 degrees, and that hopefully then is going to kind of bleed off the rest of the speed with a prop off and kind of help it flop into the grass somewhere around the landing location. In the video where we actually did the demo, I'll show you some tips and tricks. If it's landing long, you can actually set the height of the landing area to be a negative number to make it kind of come down a little bit earlier. But this is how it's going to work. So in practice, now we have these things set up, it describes how all of this is going to work. So what's going to happen? The plane is going to fly back to the landing location. It's going to fly in a circle to detect the wind. That's not going to make that much of a difference in this particular situation because I've hard coded the approach angle. Once it's got an idea of how the wind is working, it's going to then make its way to this point here. And it's going to, as it does that, get down to the 30-meter height, and it's going to fly down towards the crosswing leg. As it gets to here, it's going to perform a turn, because this is essentially a waypoint that's been dynamically created. And it's going to then go down the crosswind leg. And as it does, it's not only going to do this, and again, the length of this piece is set by half of your approach length. It's going to drop the height down to 2/3 of what it started at. So it's now going to go and drop to about 20 meters in this instance. Then it's going to turn again at this other waypoint and is going to try and get to the landing location by basically flying a straight line from this point here to the landing location. And it's going to fly down here, losing altitude all the time. Again, if you find that it's speeding up, that you're having issues with that, then you can adjust the pitch to throttle ratio to make sure that that doesn't happen. And you're just going to kind of come down here. It's going to continue to fly until it gets to the 2-meter height. At the 2-meter height, it's going to turn off the motor and essentially glide. And then if you have a LiDAR fitted, as it passes this height, and we've set that for 1 meter in this example, then it's going to flare, and then it's going to pull the nose up and then land hopefully somewhere down here. But hopefully going through that helps you understand how all these pieces go together to basically describe how this approach is going to be handled, how it's going to fly this base or crosswind leg, and then how it's going to do the final approach, and at what heights all that stuff is going to happen. So hopefully now that's a bit clearer. There's some additional things that you need to change. These are by the side. Nav waypoint radius. Make sure that the waypoints are big enough so the plane can hit them, particularly in windy conditions. Having them too small or those kind of things can cause lots of issues with navigation, and the navigation is crucial to make sure that it can not only get to the home location, but then actually hit those 2 transitions to go from the approach to the downward leg to the final approach. But I would recommend just checking all the stuff that's by the side of me here to just double check that all of it is set up and kind of makes sense, and that again, the model flies really well autonomously, because unless it can fly great autonomously and you know it can hit waypoints easily, then trying things like automated landing is just going to end in disaster. Couple of final thoughts, couple of last slides. Hopefully now this is making a little bit more sense. Landing altitude is relative to where you take it off from. So my big tip there is arm the model when it is on the floor. Don't arm the model when you're holding it in your hand. That's another meter that the model is going to be offset by, that's going to cause it to kind of do things a little bit too high. Don't forget that if you're not using a LiDAR, barometer drift is a big issue. If you're flying for any long period of time, the barometer changes temperature from being quite cold to getting quite warm. That can dramatically change the height that the plane thinks it's at. So if you're going to do this seriously, I would probably add a LiDAR. You can save a number of safe homes around, just like you do for a fixed wing, using index values 0 to 7. You can set a very specific direction, as I've just showed in that example. So if you don't want the plane just figuring it out and just coming in at the best way into the headwind, then you can specify a direction, 2 directions if it's one runway from either end, or if you have one specific way that it has to do it, because trying it over the other way will take it over, I don't know, a main road or too close to high tension wires, you can specify that too using the negative value. Make sure you have INAV 7.1.1 or later for this, although I imagine as this video is coming out, most of us will be using it with INAV 8. You can't really set the speed for landing, so that pitch to throttle thing is really important. It's going to use the standard default speeds that are set for mission stuff, so be aware of that. I would recommend, if you're going to have a go at this, play back some of the on-screen display DVR recordings of you landing your plane, and just take note of the kind of altitudes that you're doing things at, so it give you a good idea what those numbers should be, so that you can try it out and get a sensible set of numbers when you first go at the field to give it a go. So there you have it. That's kind of a basic whistle-stop tour of some of the stuff. Again, go and check the documentation out, and a big thank you to Mark for the help with these videos. Do stay tuned when I have made a video of us actually showing how to use this in a live example. We'll set it up, take it to the field, and hopefully the plane will actually land exactly where we want it to and come down the runway and hopefully do a better job than I normally do. It is an iterative setup thing. Hopefully it'll go well, but if it doesn't, I'll just film the whole thing and we'll have a good laugh about it. So stay tuned for that. But hopefully for all of those of you that are asking about this stuff, when you read that documentation in the INAV stuff, it's going to make a little bit more sense. Thank you for watching my video. Check out the playlist, and adding Painless 360 to your search terms will help you find my content. If you haven't done so already, please hit the like and subscribe button. It helps a lot. You can support the time I spend here answering questions and helping others by using the links in the video description.